is about to arrive at Oakland Airport at 2:30. Wade is right. Well, Joel and I just had 2 conversations about what we would do, and I have a few announcements, so I'd like to take the opportunity to do the announcements. I'd like to point out to the students that you're having an election for AS president, and I think it's a very important time for you to exercise your vote and go over and make sure that people understand that you are interested in the course of student government. How many of you have voted already? It's very convenient. Pretty hard to miss. So. I'm sorry?
There's also a fee referendum on the ballot.
Right. There's a fee referendum on the ballot, and you can exercise your ballot hanging over. Joel, what do you think? Joel is ready to talk endlessly about Robert Harrison. Oh, I know. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. We haven't been about it. Sitting with us today, people who helped found the Alliance, Robert Harris being the person who we're honoring today, and other people who have contributed both time and money to making sure that this became an annual event. I want to thank Joel for his work as the president of the Alliance, which is the community support group. There are many people who are in the Alliance who are here. We also have a Holocaust Faculty Advisory Committee that work very closely together to structure the programs that we have. In addition to that, we get a great deal of our support from the Provost's office. And I am so pleased that Provost Goldstein and his wife are here. And I can't thank him enough for his continued support. I also want to mention one of the people who was responsible for founding the Holocaust Lecture Series and the Holocaust Study Center, and that's Dr. John Steiner, who is Professor Emeritus of Sociology. If it wasn't for his moral imperative and his eagerness to make sure that we carried out the mission of understanding how prejudice can lead to genocide, we wouldn't be here today. So we are most grateful for all the work that Dr. Steiner has done. We also receive a great deal of support for the current Dean of Social Scientists, who you know if you're a student and you've been attending lectures. She is a Holocaust scholar herself and has agreed not only this year but last year, and I hope next year and the year after that, and to give a lecture every year for the series. We also have a lot of faculty members who have been very important in sustaining this endeavor. And one of them to recognize is Ilka Hartman, who has been here from the very beginning. Ilka gives us energy in ways that is impossible to recount, but she's always there. She's always someone I can call at the last minute and say, Ilka, would you get flowers for tomorrow? So I want to personally acknowledge and thank. I know Michael Berenbaum is coming, but I'm going to let Joel talk now.
Thank you. It's not a coincidence that this lecture series is in this place. Shortly after World War II, the Jewish community in Sonoma County began an annual commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, most often in Petaluma, and it was...
He's the author of 12 books, scores of scholarly articles, and hundreds of journalistic pieces. Among his works are a mosaic of victims, non-Jews persecuted and murdered by the Nazis, After Tragedy and Triumph, a book about the post-Holocaust world, The Vision of the Void, the theological reflections of Elie Wiesel, and Witness to the Holocaust, an illustrated documentary history of the Holocaust in the words of its victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. He has been the editor on several books, including The Holocaust, Religious and Philosophical Implications with John Roth, The Holocaust in History, The Known and the Unknown, The Disputed and the Re-Examined with Abraham Peck, and most recently, The Bombing of Auschwitz, Should the Allies Have Attempted It, with Michael.
Hypothesized that, in essence, if you turned that he knew that we had bombed a place called Buna-Monovitz, which was 5 kilometers from Birkenau. And he knew that in those days, to turn on the camera, you turned it on early, and you kept it on, and since it was a straight line between Birkenau and Buna-Monovitz, he reasoned that you would be able to get aerial photography of Birkenau. And what he then did was to requisition, and working for the CIA, he requisitioned the ancient records from 1944 of all the photography that was taken. He developed it by the technology of 1978. And lo and behold, you had literally compelling visual evidence of what could have been seen from the sky had someone bothered to develop the film in 1944. And if you bomb Phil, and if they're decent, they share it, and people on the same side don't necessarily share it. And if it had been passed, you would have gotten the fragment from Switzerland, and the fragment that was available in England, and the fragment that was available in Poland, and you would have been able to put together a full gestalt. And I interviewed one of the people who was assigned to bombing by the name of Herb Katz. He said, look, if I ever had that information in front of me, I would have assigned it. My general would have never looked twice, because I would have said, this is gone. He said, do you think my general looked every day at what my bombing assignment was? He didn't have the time. All he did was to say, what do you know, what do you do, what are your targets? It was never tasked because it literally was never even considered. Now let's put the context of Auschwitz for a moment. When you think of Auschwitz, you think of Auschwitz as the epicenter of the killing. But prior to the summer of 1944, Auschwitz was not the most lethal of the 6 Nazi death camps. More Jews had been in April 7, 1944. 2 men from Auschwitz, a man by the name of Rudolf Verba, whose name is actually Walter Rosenberg, and Alfred Wetzler, escaped. They made contact with Slovak resistance forces and produced a substantial report on the extermination of Auschwitz and Birkenau in Upper Silesia. In great detail, they documented the killing process. Their report, replete with maps and other specific details, was forwarded to Western intelligence officials along with an urgent request to bomb the camps. The man who did this was a very interesting side story, was Rabbi Michael Weissmandel, and a woman who was an ultra-Orthodox rabbi, and a woman, Giselle Fleischman, who was a Zionist and adamantly opposed to Michael Weissmandel, who would not normally have met with her except for the fact that they happened to have been cousins. And because they were cousins, they had the familial relationship before Weissmandel was a distinguished rabbi, and before Fleischman was a fiery Zionist. they happened to have played together as kids. So he continued to meet with her, and they could talk in a straight language, and they agreed to put aside their differences as to the world, what the world would look like, in order to try to rescue it so there'd be some Jews to differ over what the world should look like at the end. But understand this, that chances are these two leaders could not have dealt with each other, except for an ironic, because the ideological divisions were so far apart and the distrust so great, except for the ironic fact that they were brought up as cousins, and the divisions between them were divisions within a family. And I'll leave it to my friend Murray to talk about the family dynamics of that. But the key to it was that she could walk in, she could interrupt her studies, and she, instead of calling them rabbis, she told them that they were not either indifferent or anti-Semitic. So let's listen to no less than David Ben-Gurion when he responds as to why we can't call for bombing. Right? How many of you walking in here would have said that David Ben-Gurion would be on the record calling not to bomb Auschwitz? We do not know the truth concerning the entire situation in Poland, and it seems to me that we will be unable to propose anything concerning this matter. What concerned Ben-Gurion and his colleagues was that the bombing of the camps could cause the death of many Jews, or even one Jew. Although no specific documentation reversing the situation of June 11th has been found, officials of the very same organization were calling for bombing by July. In London, Moshe Shertak, who later became the foreign minister of Israel, and Chaim Weizmann, who later became Israel's first president, were calling for bombing in July 19, less than 1 month after the Jewish Agency said we can't call for bombing. Two explanations are permissible. One explanation is that Weizmann and Shertak were operating on their own in rivalry with Ben-Gurion and the guys in Jerusalem, not likely on this important issue. Or the second explanation, which you can suspect, is that information arrived in Jerusalem between June 11, 1944 and July 7, 1944, that showed them the truth of the situation in Poland, that made them understand the scope of the killing process, and led them to the conclusion that even if we kill Jews on the ground, what are we gaining? We are disrupting the mechanisms by which all of these people are killed. That documentation was something like the Verba Wexler report. So we learned something very important. It is clear that information that reaches the threshold of knowledge has enormous consequences for taking action. And it's also clear that the only reason you could bomb Auschwitz was because you assumed those on the ground were as good as dead. And you also grasped enough to understand that destroying the infrastructure was worth the price of the innocent lives who were going to be lost in the process. Remember Wiesel's words, we were not afraid of death, at least not of that type of death. Every bomb that dropped filled us with hope and with courage. But again, we know that. People sitting in Washington would accept this if I were teaching a class and I would put the document up on the screen and would say, now let's look at bureaucratic speak. After a study, it became apparent that such an operation could be executed only by the diversion of considerable air forces now engaged in decisive operations elsewhere, and would be of such doubtful efficacy that it would not warrant the use of our resources. Let me repeat that. I'm going to ask you the question now, and I want you to explain to me. Presume for a moment on their modest intellectual ability. No, I mean that seriously. Tell me, unpack this for me. Tell me what he's saying. Listen very carefully. You're trying to explain to somebody, what does he mean by this? After a study, it became apparent that such an operation could be executed only by the diversion of considerable air forces now in action. Never been of interest before. For 3 decades, the issue of bombing Auschwitz was a minor sidebar to the war and to the Holocaust. In May of 1978, American historian David Wyman wrote an article in Commentary magazine, Why Auschwitz Wasn't Bombed. His article provoked much positive response and was reinforced by the startling photographs that were published by the 2 leading CIA photo interpreters, Dino Bugioni and Robert Porter. Developed with technology available in 1978, but not 1944. And we have to be fair, because you would not have seen the same thing in 44 that you saw in 78. These photographs gave a seemingly vivid demonstration of what American intelligence could have known about Birkenau if only they had been interested. One photograph shows bombs dropping over the camp because the pilot released bombs early. It appeared that bombs targeted for the Farben plant were dropped. The Polish ambassador gets up from his chair. He says, "You can't say that, Felix. My government stands behind every word. I risked my life on what this man is saying." Frankfurter says, "You didn't understand. It's not that I believe what he's saying is untrue. It's that I'm not capable of believing it." Do you understand the distinction? Now, let me add to that something else. Because I've looked at that as what philosophers would call, it's a question of epistemology. How do you know? And what Frankfurter was saying is everything within me rejects this as information. Jan Karski had met in the home of a man of the father of a man who became quite famous. Happened to have been true. What Karski said was true. Now, I've written at length as to what happened to Morgenthau. Morgenthau had a moment. Henry Morgenthau was a close friend of Roosevelt's from New York. They lived adjacent neighbors. Morgenthau was a distinguished son of a distinguished father. His father was the ambassador in Turkey during the Armenian genocide. Morgenthau was of the class of Roosevelt. They had been friends a long time. What happened to Morgenthau was he had 3 non-Jewish officials, Randolph Paul, John Pelly, and Josiah Du Bois, who brought to him on January 13th, they brought to him an 18-page memo on the acquiescence of the American on January 13th, 1944. Study was not used to Kosovo. The inaction of bombing has become a symbol. And the symbol became that we didn't even bomb. Now understand something else. We have to read, and there was a period of time during the Kosovo bombing where we all had an uneasy feeling, those of us who discussed the Auschwitz bombing. Look, we bombed the hell out of Kosovo, nothing's happened. And in fact, conditions have grown worse. Remember that in the initial period of bombing of Kosovo, you had even more vindictive actions than the ones that had been taking place before it led to the bombing. So all of a sudden we said, what happens if really bombing doesn't work and responding with force to genocide doesn't work either? We got a problem because it's saying you can't respond to genocide. And I'll talk about Russia. And the population had to go without cars and rubber and gasoline and everything else. So the entire country was mobilized, so it wasn't a question of mobilizing, it was a question of directing. And therefore, it always becomes, in the case of genocide, a question of will. And what does the use of the domestic constituency mean? The domestic constituency means at least that there are political consequences for not acting. And that's a critical question. Other questions? Thank you very much.
Michael, thank you.